Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here today with Steve Williams, and we're going to talk about his family and his research. So, welcome, Steve. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
When and why did you get started researching your family?
Well, I think I was always like a little bit of an odd duck in uh, in terms of family. My name is Williams, so if you look at me, you say, "Well, this guy is like Norwegian or something." He's not Italian. I don't look Italian. My last name is Williams. So, me and my dad. So my dad met my mother in New York Harbor after World War II. He was set up with her by some of his Navy buddies who lived in New Jersey. So he met my mother in New York Harbor. He's from the state of Washington. Met her and got married, and I think he went back like once, and that was it. So then they moved in with my grandparents, who were both on my mother's parents, who were both born in Italy, came over like in the 1905, sort of turn of the century. So I became interested because the only family that I ever knew growing up in New Jersey were Italian people, and they all had names like Tony and Uncle Frank and Vito, and I'm like Stefan, like Stephen, like where did that come from? And then also I was an only child, so apparently my mother had some difficulties with the birth, and so I was an only child. So then, and my father died when he was like 68. Then my mother died shortly after. So I basically became like, sort of like a ship adrift at sea. Like I didn't, I was out of touch with my Italian cousins. They were very in touch when my grandmother was alive, and then every generation, it just kind of fell apart to the point where I don't have much contact with them. So I really, being that only child, and now my parents are dead, I wanted to really sort of connect with, my roots. And so I became heavily steeped in genealogy, and I've been doing genealogy for probably 30, 35 years. Some of the work was done, by me, going out to Salt Lake City, and then I've probably hired 5 or 6 genealogists, professional genealogists over the years, including a guy in Avellino, Italy, by the name of Joe Di Simone, who helped me with some of my Italian roots. So that's how I got interested. And but amazingly enough, as a kid, I was curious, and I was much more curious than my parents. Like my parents knew, they knew like nothing about, if they might know like who their grandmother was, but that's like it. And, so I actually asked my grandfather and my grandmother when I was maybe 10 years old. I said, so I know you were born in Italy, like, where in Italy were you were born in? So I actually got like the firsthand, from their lips. And my grandmother, fortunately, actually even told me the village. So that made it, like a little bit easier. But I didn't do anything, from 10 years on, probably in my 30s, I started getting more involved in the, actual research.
Yeah, so that's a very long time ago. I mean, I was a big history buff, so and I guess I really started in earnest maybe 15 years ago or something like that. But to start 30, 35 years ago, that's a long time, and I wish I had asked the grandparents, and anybody that I talk to now asks me where do I start, I say go ask grandma,
Yeah,
because
right.
that's the place to start.
Yeah.
So where is your mom's family from?
All right. So mom's family, which is the one I have the most interest in, I basically made a pledge that I would go back and see that village. So she is from the province of Naples, a city called Caserta. So Caserta is where the Reggia is, the palace. And then she told me actually the village, and the village is Tuoro. Tuoro. So Tuoro is like a subset of frazione, I guess they call it, of Caserta, and small, tiny place, and that kind of leads me to one of my first stories here, because my name is Stephen with a PH, so it reads like Stephen. So I said to my mother, and this was several times when she was alive, I said, Mom, like, how did you get the name Stephen? Like, where in God's name did that come from? So she said it was your grandmother. So her mother's mother, who was a Teresina D'Amico, and she married Andrea Verdicchio. So the family name back there was Verdicchio. And I asked her, she said, so your great grandmother wanted you named that name. So, and I said, why? And she says, I don't know. I mean, you would think like, well, wouldn't you ask her why? And, again, it's sort of a lack of curiosity, but, these are people who went through the wars, they went through the Depression. So, they were more focused on making ends meet, not, doing a genealogy study. Right. So, but when I went back I visited Tuoro, and I actually made contact with, distant cousins, ancient cousins that still live in that village, that have an unbroken line in that village, and their last name, my grandmother's maiden name, of Verdicchio. So I visited Tuoro with my cousin Alessandro, and it's a teeny tiny place. I mean, the village is like, maybe I don't even think it's a square mile. I don't know how big it is, but maybe 500 houses, something like this. So there's one church in the entire village, and that church is San Stefano.
Ah.
So that was my answer. Why was she so fixated? And so I have a lot more to tell about that encounter.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story about how'd you get the name, because I was sure you were going to say it was the grandparent or something, which is the way it usually is. But I guess they wanted to have that tie back, or your great grandmother wanted to have that tie back to the village, right? So that's an interesting story. So you go there with your cousin now, and you're finding, which it's amazing to find that you still have relatives there, and because a lot of the small towns have dissipated, and there's a tenth of the people that used to be there.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with PhilItaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co.
Yeah, so I spoke with Joe DeSimone. He's a genealogist. He's in Avellino. Did some nice work for me, and most of the work in terms of putting the pieces together for me came from the churches. And Joe said to me, he said, Steve, the municipalities are completely uncooperative. Like they don't want to be bothered, but the churches, maybe he made a donation, I don't know, but he said the churches are like relatively cooperative. So I said to him, Joe, I said, I told him a story about these people, and I actually found Alessandro through just Googling, Tuoro, Verdicchio, the name, and then he was like a real estate agent in the town. He's a young man, he's in his 30s, so we started corresponding for probably 3 or 4 years. At first, I'm sure his family thought I was, a nut, from America, some kind of scam artist, but then I started sending them photos and telling them the story. And actually, the funny thing is, like, one of his brothers, Alberto, actually looks a lot like my Uncle Jimmy. I mean, they could be doubles. I mean, it's really, really amazing. But I said to Joe DeSimone, I said, Joe, so could you actually tie down for me how I'm related to these people? And he said, Steve, he goes, yes, I could do that. But he said, the relationship is probably, 3 or 4 generations back. You're talking, 150 years. All these people had like 8, 9, 10 kids. They all had the same names, Carmela, Anthony, Francesco. I mean, they all had the same names. He goes, it's going to cost you a lot of money for me to pinpoint who it is. He goes, but I can tell you this. If they're telling you that they lived in Tuoro with an unbroken line as far back as they can remember, these are your cousins. We just don't, and it's really unimportant, like, who the common ancestor was. So, and Joe, through the church, was able to trace my Verdicchio ancestry in Tuoro back to like the early 1700s. So, and I have the succession of people, after that. So, but going there and particularly visiting the church was really an incredible experience. I mean, it was just mind-boggling. And my cousin Alessandro, he speaks very good English, and he wanted me to go in the church and meet the priest and get as much information I had. And he was actually like a little aggressive. He's like knocking on the door, Finally I was waiting in the background. Finally, I see this priest come out. The priest is a young guy like him, in his 30s. They're pointing over to me, crazy. So finally the priest says, okay, come in. So I go in, we sit down with the priest in his office, and Alessandro's trying to get, like, he wants to go through like all the books and do research. And I said, Alessandro, I have all this information already. I have everything. So we don't need to bother the priest with this. So anyway, but the church is over 1,000 years old, and it's been added onto, but like the original building is over 1,000 years old. And if you look at the side of the church, on one of the walls, they have the names of all the many of my relatives, but the people who died in World War I and World War II, the names are on the side of the church, and they're all names that I recognize, whether these were Verdicchio people or Roncella, which was another name that married into the family. And so I'm seeing all these names. It's really incredible. I had such an extensive family in this little village. And the priest said to me, this is, where your family comes from. So this is a really amazing story that I'm going to tell you now. So I'm sitting in front of the priest, and I look up to the right on this adjacent wall, and he has a cross, a crucifix. And it's unlike any crucifix that you would typically see. There's no body of Christ on the crucifix. It's just like an inlaid crucifix. As a matter of fact, maybe I can, this is actually the crucifix here. So you can see, looking at this, it's very unusual, right? I mean, it's like gold leaf. It's got, all this like inlay in it. So I had bought this crucifix in Italy when we were in Venice several years ago, and I think it was made in, I bought it in Amalfi, but I think it was made in the Murano factory. So now we're very far away from where I bought this church, like where I bought the crucifix, like hundreds of miles away in this little church in the middle of nowhere. So, and this is the only crucifix that I have in my entire house, hanging up in my dining room. So I look up at that wall on the right-hand side. He has the identical crucifix, not similar, identical. I took a photo of it, all the colors, everything. So I told the priest the story, and tears came to my eyes because I thought this was really an incredible coincidence, and this is one in millions or billions. I mean, this is crazy. So the priest, without missing a beat, he said to me, he goes, "Of course." He goes, "Who do you think brought you here? Why do you think you're here?" He goes, "God brought you here, and he's just giving you a sign." And that was such a meaningful experience for me.
Wow, that's that. Yeah, and I say this all the time. I've interviewed a lot of people, and one person in particular who, is I guess like a psychic type of person or something like that, and I'm convinced that they want to be found. The ancestors want to be
Yeah.
found, and there are these subtle clues that or things that happen that just aren't coincidence.
Right.
But that's
Yeah.
something. I mean, I haven't heard something that profound. That you bought this cross years before, and then you get there, and the same cross is there.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And for him to say that,
Yeah. Yeah. So then so I told him, I said, look, my Verdicchio ancestors go back to the early 1700s, and that's what we could find. So, I mean, they may even go back, who knows? I mean, they may have lived in this place for like 1,000 years. I mean, who knows? But the earliest one was a Pasquale. He was born in like the 1720s or something. So anyway, the priest grabs me, he takes me into the church in the baptismal area. So there's a baptismal font. This baptismal font probably weighs like, I don't know, 4,000 pounds. I mean, it was carved. It was carved from like a solid block of marble. I mean, this thing is huge. It must be 5 feet high, or probably 4 feet high, and then the basin is probably 42 inches across. I mean, it's freaking huge. So he goes, look at the bottom, and the bottom has got the date that's carved in the baptismal font. And it was like 1452 or something like that. This is like 600 years old, this thing. He goes, this is where Pasquale was baptized 300 years ago. This is where your great-grandmother was baptized. This is where your grandmother was baptized. All of these people in your family history, they were all married here. And it was just really just crazy. And there's a bench outside the church, and the bench is like solid stone. I don't know if it's granite or marble. I don't know what it is, but it has a depression in it from people sitting on it. So the stone must have been there for several hundred years. And it's all, the middle of it is all depressed from people sitting on it. But this must be a bench that my ancestors sat on, 300 years ago. I mean, it's got to be the same one. And the priest showed us this bench, and he goes, look at this. He was very cordial, and I made a nice donation to the church. And I actually think at some point I'd like to take my granddaughter and my grandson and have them, rebaptized, in this church. So it was really an amazing experience, with that church.
Yeah, that's incredible. So now, were you able to connect with other cousins there
Well, yes. So in other words, they introduced me to other people. They introduced me to their parents. So this would be like, so Alessandro's parents are my age. So then they introduced me to the parents, Alessandro's grandparents and other cousins, and we went out to dinner, and it was really kind of neat. But what's amazing is many of these Italian people of our generation, Bob, they don't speak English.
Right.
But the newer kids do. So, my son's age, they speak English, but the people our age or older, forget about it. I mean, they speak less English than I speak Italian. But I am more in touch with this branch of the family than any other branch of my family. And we use WhatsApp, and I'm constantly getting messages. We're sending pictures back and forth. On like Christmas, they call me up. We do like a FaceTime kind of thing on WhatsApp, and they really have that warm Italian family, feeling where it's very important that they keep the ties with me. They actually visited me. Alessandra's younger brother, Valerio, visited me in America. And then, of course, I visited them, the one time, but I want to go back. They live near Tuoro. They moved, so they're in some other village. It's not Tuoro, but it's 2 minutes away. So
Yeah, so
really
so
nice.
did they know that they had any relatives in America?
We'll be right back.
Lafayette, we are here, the French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman. Learn all about France's fascinating history, its great characters like Charlemagne, Joan of Arc, Louis XIV, or Napoleon, but also the great events that marked France, Europe, and sometimes the whole world. Lafayette, we're here, available wherever you get your podcast or on LafayettePodcast.com. À bientôt.
Yes, they had knowledge that part of the family moved to America, but it was several generations removed from them, and they didn't really know exactly who it was. And this was a big family, and they came over through Ellis Island, and they settled in Hoboken and Jersey City, which is where I'm from. And the same thing with my grandfather. They settled in Hoboken and Jersey City, but they did know that the people that went over to America settled in New Jersey and Hoboken in particular. So they did know that. So so I think the common ancestor is probably like sort of like a great grandfather to me would be the it's probably around the thing. But when I tried to figure it out myself from the information they gave me, but there's just too many people. They all have 10, 12 kids. They all use the same name.
I know, that's the hardest thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to find, and there's not a lot of specificity in the records, so it becomes like a Sherlock Holmes game thing to try to figure out match. Okay, it's birthday, what's the mother's name? It's very hard to figure it out. But I said to him, look, it doesn't matter. We don't need to trace this back. We know we're cousins. And I told them to get the ancestry DNA done, but to date, they haven't done that.
Yeah, I'm trying. We were supposed to go a couple. We had to cancel twice already, but I'm going next spring. I don't care what's going on, but I want to bring a few kits with me to give to some of my cousins there. And I did the same thing you did with my dad's mother. I just went on, I went on Facebook and I just started looking. Her name's not very common. It's Piermalo, and so there's only one family with that name, and. I got a hit with one person, Jincia, who's been really like fabulous. She doesn't speak English, so same thing, I cut and paste out of Google Translate and things like that. But she started a group on Facebook thinking that she was going to find either Spain, where the family's originally from, 400, 500 years ago, or South America. She had no idea that there were anybody in the family from America, and in fact there were only two, my grandmother and her aunt. So when we made the connection, it was just incredible. And I've been doing this with this family, I don't know how many, 8, 10 years, whatever it is. And I was just finally, with her help, able to piece together and found a second cousin. And what's crazy about this, now these two families, one family's in America, my grandmother's in America, his family's in Italy. My great-grandfather's name was Nicola.
Okay.
And my father was the second son, so he was named Nicholas after his maternal grandfather.
Right.
His grandfather was the same generation as my father, 3 years apart, born 3 years apart. He was Nicola.
Okay.
His name is Roberto. My name's Robert.
Right.
He has a son, Nicola. And I have a daughter, Nicole, and my sister has a son, Nicholas. So,
Yeah.
Again,
Funny.
coincidence probably, but
Yeah.
it's that's a really weird coincidence that each generation going down has the same names.
Yeah.
And it was
my daughter's Nicole.
there you go, but it was just so weird to find that, and I had no idea when I started all this thing that I would ever find anybody as close as a second cousin in Italy. So hopefully when we get there, we'll be able to meet and everything. So now I have to ask you now, have you done research on your father's side?
Yes, I have. Well, let me tell you a little bit about my grandfather. So this would be the other guy that came from Italy. So this would be Anna Verdicchio's husband. So this is the Italian half of the equation. The people that I lived with, that I grew up with, we lived in the same house. So he came back from World War I. His name was Antonio Fontano. And he came back from World War I, and he was injured in the war. He was in the trench warfare in the Argonne forest of France. He was gassed, with the mustard gas.
Yeah.
And my grandmother was a Red Cross nurse. So that's like kind of how they met. So, they lived downstairs from us. So I obviously had, daily interaction with them. But my grandfather, was really so traumatized from the war. I mean, he was really, it's hard for him to breathe, but even despite the breathing issues with the mustard gas, what it did to his lungs, he worked like a mule. If he couldn't get his car started, he would walk to work, like 15 miles. This is the way these people work.
Right.
But amazingly, again, as a kid, I asked him where he was from in Italy. And then when I did the genealogy, I found like his draft cards and his discharge papers and all that stuff. So he was born in a place called Palomonte. And Palomonte, nobody knows where that's from. You may think you've heard of it, but it's a tiny little village in Italy. So if you looked at Sorrento, people know where Sorrento is. So it would be maybe 30 miles east of Sorrento. So it's kind of like in the middle of the boot in southern Italy, same like latitude as Sorrento. So I hired a car to go to this Palomonte, and it was all dirt roads. I mean, it was hard. It was difficult to even get into the village because it was all dirt roads, and they had earthquakes a few years ago, and things were like really messed up. But the one thing that some of these Fontano people, like my cousins and stuff, told me was they said the name is really not Fontano, it's Fontana. And so he changed it, I guess, to be more of the masculine valve at the end, or some who knows what the reason was. Yeah, again, you would think somebody would ask him, because they had these suspicions, way back when, like, why wouldn't you ask him? But I guess if you knew my grandfather, that may answer itself, because he was a pretty tough cookie, and he didn't engage in a lot of small talk. But anyway, so I go to Palomonte. I'm there in Palomonte. So I'm seeing like all these ancient churches where I'm sure like he was baptized. And there actually is a section in Palomonte called Fontana. So it's like a neighborhood. So that's got to be, those people. And I had my driver go out. There was some guys in the neighborhood that looked like they lived there, but they were men that were in their late 70s, 80s. These were older people. And so the driver comes back in the car. He goes, yes, I spoke with them. And they said, yes, there was a Fontana family. living in here. They did a little farming. He goes, the whole family left, around the turn of the century. So, but that's about all I have. I wasn't able to connect with any people. There are no Fontanas living in Palomonte currently. I think there's maybe 300 people living there. Very tiny village, and but I'm still in touch with my grandfather's brother's son, who's a little bit older than me. So we've compared notes. So that's the story on my grandfather. But they all came to Ellis Island. They all settled in Hoboken. They all settled in in the area. Now my father, of course, is Anglo. And
Right.
I have more information on my dad than I do on the Italian side, because these people, they were in America for many, many years. So if you trace my dad and just go back in a direct line, the people that they came over from Wales. Their name was Williams. They came over in like the mid 1700s. And the son of the guy who came over was an Edward John Williams, and he fought in the Revolutionary War. And he was one of the early settlers of Kentucky. And he had members of his family kidnapped by Indians.
Yeah, I've heard that before, but from somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah, so he got like his buddies together, and they found like this Indian camp, and people were killed, and I think he got his wife back, but the son was killed. And the reason I know this is because when you tap into someone who fought in the Revolutionary War, chances are there are other people that are following this guy.
Yeah.
And they've appended like newspaper articles and stuff to the records. So that's kind of how I know this. The other interesting story with this guy is his older brother was Evan Williams. And Evan Williams is a bourbon. And the Evan Williams bourbon was named after my great uncle, Evan Williams. And he was one of the first like corn whiskey distillers in the area. And Evan Williams, the bourbon, has no real affiliation with him other than this guy is in the Kentucky Historic Records. So they just took the name.
Use the name.
Yeah. So I should go back there and visit the distillery and have a lawsuit, at least demand some bourbon or do something.
At least get a case of bourbon or something. Yeah.
Something. Yeah, exactly.
Well, see, my kids are adopted, and my daughter, her family, I've traced her family all the way back to England, and she and her her birth father, he died very, very young. I mean, he died. She did get to meet him, but he died maybe 2 years after she met him, maybe 5 years ago. But his family, I was able to get way, way back, and she's actually a distant cousin of Princess Diana through the Despencer family. Okay. And she's a direct descendant of Daniel Boone.
Wow.
And a direct descendant of Captain Morgan the pirate.
Oh wow. Yeah.
So like you said, if you're able to make that connection, it's pretty cool, some of the people that I found. And I also found that there were three brothers from Italy, the Bassano brothers. They were musicians, and they went to England, and they were court musicians for Henry VIII.
Oh, wow.
And they stayed there. So she's got Italian, great grandfathers, because they married, obviously, English women. Right. And it was really incredible to be able to trace her back to some Italian family from, I guess they were from, I think they were originally from Venice, I want to say.
Okay.
But, it is easier, to your point, it is a little bit easier in the States because, especially Revolutionary War, Civil War, you could find, you could find some good records on them. So I'm going to assume, because you said your father grew up on the West Coast, yeah? So did the family kind of just trek across?
Yeah, well, no. He was born in Tacoma, Washington, and he was, they were like relatively poor people, like, pretty lower income type, situation, like just trying to make ends meet, which is not, unlikely for, people of that, Depression era type, families. So, so no one came across. They all stayed there. And as a matter of fact, even stayed in like the same town or, one town over. But here's the funny thing is I got, through Ancestry, which I have no business affiliation with Ancestry, but I think they're great. I mean, I think their algorithms and stuff really terrific. So anyway, one of my father's sister's, I guess it'd be her granddaughter, she did the DNA. And so she found me showing up as like a second cousin, and her last name now is Hunstock. So she contacted me, and I didn't know of those people. So I knew immediately like who that was. And so I was able to fill in everything. And her dad is David Hunstock, and he was like my dad's favorite like nephew, this guy, for whatever reason. And so they told me he was having an 80th birthday a couple of years ago. So I actually went there for the 80th birthday, paid for everything, rented out a restaurant, and he didn't know I was coming. Now, we had spoken on the phone a couple of times, so he was thrilled, and that we're still in touch. So I walk up behind him, and I put a photo in front of him of my dad from like when my dad was younger. And I said, "Do you know who that is?" And he looks at me. He goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Do you know who I am?" And he shook his head, "No." I said, I'm Stevie. I'm Tom's son." And oh man, it was
That's so nice.
spectacular.
Yeah,
it was really spectacular. So now I'm like really in touch with these people now. Like we correspond and Facebook and Messenger and talk on the phone. And so it's reawakened a side of the family that we were really cut off from.
Yeah.
And because like back then, like my parents were not, they were, I wouldn't say poor, but maybe like a level over poor. And so they couldn't like hop on the plane or even make a long phone call. My dad was a factory worker, so he couldn't spend, money on so it's easy to lose touch. And that's why many of these Italian families that came over, in the turn of the century, they basically had to cut ties. Maybe they would go back and forth, maybe for the first couple of years, but then that was it. Then everything faded away because they just didn't have the money to make the trips or, send letters, and people just sort of fade away. So that's why I was so thrilled. And I know my grandparents would be very proud of me that I was able to reconnect with their villages where there was no contact for like 120 years. I know they'd be thrilled with that. So I was happy to do it.
Yeah, and Steve, what amazes me is that how few people see the value in all of this. I mean, to me, it's the same thing. When I make a connection, I mean, to connect with somebody in Italy that's second, third, fourth cousin, whatever. To me, it's helping you figure out who you are and where you came from. And so few people get it. You know what I mean?
Right. Oh, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No. Like when you were talking about some of the, your ancestors who were famous people, and I could tell you the same stories. And when people come over and I tell them these stories, they just glaze over. And I think they think that we're lying, that we're making all this stuff up, or it's not real. They laugh. They think it. I think they think it's funny that I believe this. They think I'm nuts. But the reality is, they all would have the same kind of stories and the same connections. The only difference is you and I have spent thousands of hours researching this stuff and putting it into a database where they haven't done anything. And so we know what these connections are. And
I'm working. I'm getting there. I'm working on a book, and thankfully I have somebody who's a good friend of mine. His daughter's helping me edit it. But I've been going through because I can, and because of some of these noble families, and I'm going through it, and these are stories that I've never heard before. You know, you can't just find these things in the Encyclopedia Britannica, but I give you a perfect example of one thing I found. There's one family, for 5 generations, they were the justice, quote unquote, executioner. So for 100 years, the father, the son, the grandson, the great grandson, they all held this title. And I don't think they were the guy who actually, hung some. I think they were the person who the king set off with his head and they signed the paper. But that to me is just incredible to find out the history of these people. And maybe it's just because I was always a history nut in school. Right. And I find it fascinating. But I have the same thing. I talk to people and they just look at me like I'm out of my mind. Like, why do you care?
Yeah. So I got one story. This is on my wife's side, which kind of illustrates your point a little bit. So my wife came from, a Southern girl. Mother was from Alabama, mother and father from Alabama. Really like pretty poor people. These are very poor people. And I've started doing her genealogy, and she has a great grandmother by the name of Amanda Carmon, Carmon. And one of the interesting things with Ancestry, I'm sure is that if you tap into somebody who is a descendant of a famous person, you may find that person in many other genealogy databases, and you basically get cross references from people that are researching that family line. So sure enough, this Amanda Carmon, who was born in Sand Mountain, Alabama. I mean, like freaking dirt poor. Okay. So she is the direct descendant of John Carmon, who came over in the 1600s and whose best friend was Robert Fordham of Fordham University fame in New York. And they actually founded Hempstead, Long Island. They actually purchased Hempstead, Long Island from the Indians. So this is a direct descendant, this woman. And I have, because Carmon was such a famous name, there must be 30 other people who've done years and years and years and years of research. So I have everything documented here. And John Carmon, his family goes back to the Domesday Book in England, from the year 1000, when King Edward did the survey of every livestock and everything of value in the Kingdom of England. And that family dates back to the Domesday Book, and also had Carmons, like his son of the Domesday Book guy, fought in the first Crusades. So, here I am with my wife and her sisters, who think they just came from obscure, poverty-stricken people who, just peasant type people. And, and here I've opened up this golden book of information on just how noteworthy their family lineage is.
Yeah, I'm going to have to check my ex-wife's tree, because her family, she's some of her descendants are from the Wright family. And they were big on Long Island. They owned farms in Hempstead, Flushing, places like that. So it's quite possible there's a connection there somewhere.
Yeah.
And she has some English roots like that. And then she also has some, Dutch roots. And I found out that her I guess the third or fourth great grandfather, he owned Rikers Island.
Oh, wow.
It was the Ricken family, or Van Ricken, whatever it was. Yeah, and they sold Rikers Island to New York City in something like, I don't know, 1850, 1860, something like that.
Wow.
So, yeah, you're right. Once you start drilling into it, you do find those other crazy connections around it. But I'm gonna have to check and see if she's got any Carmens in her tree.
Yeah.
And I found a great guy. His name is Kai White. He's it's probably I guess probably about 75. I guess he is. West Point graduate, really nice guy, and he's an expert on not only Revolutionary and Civil War, but tracing back those people back to England.
Right.
And he makes some amazing charts to go along with that. Well, I really, really appreciate the time, Steve. This has been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Yeah.
I love talking about this crap, as you can understand.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
So even though there's a lot of people don't understand, we all get it. So we're in the elite, let's say.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks again and take care.